Hey fearsome friends. My back is holding up and I'm feeling a lot better now. And again, I'm sorry for the slow video output. But now, it's definitely time to sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm. Because it's time to let your nightmares in. Around July-August of 2021, my city was under its second major COVID lockdown, where you weren't allowed to have any guests over at your house at all, and I had just moved back in with my parents, as my lease had ended in early July, and I decided not to renew it. I'm in my late 20s, and my mother was a big stickler for the COVID laws, so my girlfriend wasn't even allowed on our big front porch, which was incredibly annoying. But anyway, on to the story. My girlfriend and I would often go for walks around a local creek near my house, and we were newly together, so we had certain needs, if you know what I mean. Now there was a hidden side path attached to the main walkway that goes through the creek, and we would sneak off into it to get intimate. One night at about 7 p.m, it was winter, so it was pitch black in this creek, and we decided to walk to our spot. My girlfriend was excited, so decided to skip ahead of me, and I was walking slowly whilst she was 7 meters in front. Once I turned the corner into the side area, I noticed she was on her phone, and she was acting suspiciously, checking the weather and other apps, all of a sudden saying to me, "Okay, it's time for me to go home." I said, "Oh, okay," and she told me she didn't want to do anything anymore. "No worries," I said, and as we started walking away, she whispered to me, "There's someone right behind you." "What?" I said, surprised, and turned my head over my right shoulder to see a man in all black with his hoodie up, and he was squatting and hiding in the bushes just staring at us. Now where this bush is on top of a ledge about 3 to 4 feet above the path, so while the man in black was squatting down, our faces were basically aligned. I immediately said, "What the hell?" as I was pretty caught off guard, so I said it weakly, and this man didn't react at all. He didn't gasp, say hello, or excuse himself, or any of the usual things a person would say if people had noticed each other in the pitch-black woods. He just stared at us as we walked away, and I asked my girlfriend how she'd even noticed him. She said when she'd walked down the trail before I got there, she saw the man on his phone, and as soon as she arrived, the man in the hoodie turned his phone off. We left that walkway and went up another that was kind of close by. And as we were walking up the parallel side trail, we could see the man still hiding in the bushes, staring at us. It was dark, but there was a faint light from the moon. So while this is not really scary, it's more of a creepy, unexplained event. I, a 21-year-old female, works at my local library, and my job consists of fixing broken technology and hanging out in the teen area to make sure nobody dies. Tonight, 2 teenage boys walked in, about 15 minutes removed from each other. One of them was fine, logged into a video game and started playing, but the other one was considerably less fine. I knew something was a bit strange almost immediately, as he smelled like bologna and had body odor, and seemed to stare at me wherever I went with this unreadable expression. But hey, sometimes teenagers are weird, and sometimes they smell bad, so I brushed it off. Now while I was putting books back on the shelves, he followed me around asking if my personality matched my combat boots. I didn't really know how to respond, so I just said yes. Then he asked me if I liked to try new things, in a way that was pretty suggestive now that I think about it. But I completely missed his cue, and I blame my asexuality. But regardless, I told him that I liked to try new things, assuming he was talking about sports or food or something like that. He then asked if I wore leather, to which I said no. once again having no idea what he was actually talking about. I continued putting books onto the shelves, and he told me that he could never do my job. I asked why not, and he gestured to the other boy in the library, bragging that he'd done well in a match of Fortnite. And he told me that he was too much of an asshole to ever tolerate kids the way I can. Now, when someone tells me they're an asshole, I tend to take their word for it, so he wasn't exactly getting brownie points with that particular sentiment. So I shrugged and told him I liked the job, and the kids were actually a bonus for me. Eventually I sat back down at the desk, and he pulled a chair up so closely that I could feel his breath on my back, and he asked me why I wore a mask. I couldn't at this point report him to security, because he was right behind me, and would be able to see what I was doing on the computer I was using. I didn't want to risk making him angry, so I told him it was because I was recovering from a cold. He seemed to accept this answer for a while, until he saw me remove my mask briefly to drink from my water bottle, and once I'd put my mask back on, he poked me in the arm and told me to leave the mask off, as I was too pretty to wear something like that. At that point I was done, and I emailed my co-worker, telling them I was ready for my break, hoping just to wait him out. But my co-worker was busy trying to fix something somewhere else in the library, and once again, reporting him to security was off the table, so I had to endure a little longer. He asked me about where I lived, what social media I used, could he have my social media, and where my hometown was, etc. And I managed to dodge questions as he leaned towards me, his breath smelling like a year-old pound of bacon, his face inches from the back of my head. Eventually he got up to leave and walked out of the room, and I breathed a sigh of relief, getting back to whatever I was doing before. But then he came back in and carried on talking to me. My co-worker arrived just as I was explaining to him once again that it was unprofessional to give my social media usernames, and I promptly got up and went to the restroom, bidding the strange boy a good night, hoping he would get the hint and leave. But no, he was still there when I returned. My co-worker thanked me for returning to save him from the patron, as apparently while the boy wasn't sexually harassing my co-worker, he was inexplicably intense. He attempted to drum up more conversation after that, but I think after a while he got bored and left, so I then reported him to security and tried to go back to being productive, but I just wanted to call my mum and crawl into bed at that point, so not much else got done. This story occurred a few years back, and I would have been around 8 or 9 at the time. My bedroom then faced out towards the street, and also happened to be right next to our front door. It was very small, as it had been built in place of our old front porch, and the roof was slanted slightly downwards towards the window. It took up most of the wall, and the bed could only fit in one way. It was painted purple, not a nice purple either, and my bed sat facing towards the door to my bedroom, parallel to the window. A closet took up part of the corner between my bedroom door and the window, all in all making it for quite an unusual space. Every night I checked to make sure the curtains were shut all the way, as the idea of people watching from the street made me very uncomfortable, even at a young age, where things like that shouldn't even cross my mind. I slept soundly, with no nightmares, no sudden noises waking me in the middle of the night. Nothing. But that was until the middle of the year during a school break. I remember waking to the sound of someone breathing, and I couldn't move, couldn't catch my own breath. I was just stuck. I remember so clearly seeing a man stood in the corner of my room, stuck partly behind the curtain as if it would hide him, but of course I could see him. He was just this dark entity who stood and watched, and after what felt like hours, I was able to get back to sleep. In the morning I told my mum about what had happened, and she explained it was just a nightmare and that I was fine, but the way she said it wasn't very believable. Now, these cases of sleep paralysis went on for about a year, taking me up to the middle of the next year, when I was around 8 or 9. I remember waking in the middle of the night, just like I had most nights for the last year, to the same man in the corner, only this time I could move. I stayed absolutely still regardless, despite now knowing he was actually there. I could hear his faint breathing, like he was trying to hide from me as much as I was trying to hide from him. But I couldn't help thinking, has this man been here every night this year? I remember the thoughts I had, being that I'd run out of my room screaming for my mum, she'd call the police, and this man would be arrested and sent away. But I couldn't do that, as he was basically in front of the door. I spent the night staring at him instead, trying to fall asleep, and I'd say it was around 5 a.m. when I was finally able to drift off, just as the birds started to rise. When I woke up, he was gone, and the first thing I did was tell my mum. She already looked uneasy, like she already knew, and that's when I heard 2 people talking outside. I found out later the people outside were my neighbour and a police officer who were taking an eyewitness statement. Around 6 in the morning, our neighbour had spotted a man standing outside my window, so she called the police, but he was gone before they'd arrived. Other neighbours had also stepped forward, saying they'd seen him outside in the middle of the day looking at our house. There were no signs of forced entry, only 2 footprints in the flower bed outside my window. But my mother told the officers my account of what had happened, and they came to the conclusion that he'd done the same thing last year. I'd seen it too, and it sparked my tangent of sleep paralysis. The street light outside projected his shadow, so it appeared as though he was stood in my room, but this whole time he'd been waiting patiently outside. Who knows what would have happened if my neighbour hadn't spotted him on her way out to work. Just a few minutes and she could have missed him entirely. So generally speaking, I believe some of these experiences were demonic in nature, and were not only experienced just by me in some cases. But regardless of what they were, I'm not freaked out, and I am a mentally sane 26-year-old. The only issue I deal with is ADHD, which I have under control, and I attribute some of these cases to simply horrible dreams or night terrors, which I won't be mentioning here, as simply put, that's all they were. But either way, here's some of my experiences. My first one is still a strange memory for me. I was around 16 when it happened, and I was sleeping in the back of my parents' home by the garage, which was separated from the rest of the family. At the time, I was going through some tough times with the family. I had told them I was bisexual, and they didn't really take it all that well. They're a very Christian family, so they sent me to conversion therapy. Not electrodes to the brain kind of stuff. The accepting Jesus and renouncing my ways. I went to it for about 3 months and lied my way out of it. But my parents found out, and of course weren't too happy. At the time, however, I'd say I was pretty mentally stable, still doing my thing to the best of my ability, and this is when my first experience started. It was late at night at around 10 p.m. when I decided to go to bed. My cat slept with me every night, R.I.P. Lala, and I'd have the door shut when I woke up at around 2 a.m. to go to the bathroom, which is located across the house. I felt a slight unease, but thought nothing of it, then went back to my room where I noticed the temperature had dramatically dropped. It was really cold, and this is in Florida during the summer. Now I love it when my room is cold, so once again thought nothing of it, shut my door and climbed into bed, wrapping myself like a mummy in my blankets to where my nose was only sticking out. Once I'd done that, my cat started throwing a fit. She was hissing at the corner of the ceiling and generally looked terrified. Then she started clawing at the door to get out. It was all very strange, and I was getting irritated, asking her to stop, as there was nothing there at all. I eventually let my cat out and she bolted across the house, so I shut the door and got back into bed, wrapping myself up again. Now generally it takes me roughly 30 to 45 minutes to fall asleep on a night. It's never been in a few minutes time span. But moving on, I was back under my blankets and had my eyes closed. Then I attempted to move to get comfortable, but realized very quickly that I couldn't. I was experiencing what I thought to be later on sleep paralysis, and it was at this moment where I felt a horrible unease, as anyone would going through this, but it was the voices that messed with me a little. I started hearing these guttural voices whispering in various tones in some language I couldn't understand. The only thing I could understand was my name being said every now and then, until the voices continually increased in volume, almost to a muted thunder. Then suddenly, it stopped, and that's when I felt something large crawl onto my bed, pin my arms and legs down, and began pushing me. It felt like a ton of pressure, and I could feel myself sinking down. But the worst part was when I was lifted up and turned over, and after that I blacked out. I awoke in the same position and got the hell out of the room, and that's when I started doing some research. Like I said, sleep paralysis is very similar, but generally you come out of a sleep into sleep paralysis. Like I said, sleep paralysis is very similar. This was an instantaneous moment of me shutting my eyes and these events occurring. Another notable experience was back when I was 18 and had a girlfriend. I decided one day to go to her place after work and took a nap whilst she watched TV, just sitting beside me on the bed. I fell asleep on my side facing her mirrored closet, and I woke up in the same position, and she was still watching TV. I could see myself in the mirror I was facing, but when I attempted to move, I couldn't. Alright, I'm dealing with sleep paralysis again, or so I thought. I noticed that everything else seemed frozen too. My girlfriend wasn't moving at all, the TV wasn't flashing various colours, and everything was completely still. When I realised that, I felt a horrible presence appear behind me, which seemed impossible because there was nothing but a wall behind me. This was the first time I'd felt anything so horrible, terrifying, and so magnificent in a sense. But then it got even weirder. I felt this presence enter my body, and the second this happened, the sound of what I can only describe as a chaotic wind tunnel occurred. I started shaking pretty hard, attempting to expel whatever it was, and I was pushing as hard as I could mentally to get it out. Thankfully then, after what seemed like forever, it finally vanished and I sat up. I looked at my girlfriend who was crying, and she wouldn't look at me. Then once she'd calmed down, she told me what had happened. In essence, I'd started violently shaking in my sleep, and she turned me on my back, and as I said, I was looking at myself. And after I'd opened my eyes, she described my face as looking old and like someone else's. She said my eyes looked completely different. They were manic and not my own. Apparently I sat up without breaking eye contact with her and slapped her pretty hard on the left side of her face. It was very red too, something you'd expect from a slap. So that was a pretty wacky experience. My girlfriend and I also experienced another situation together, when we had gone to the movies to see Insidious Chapter 2. Later that night, we were the only ones in the theatre, and I couldn't help but feel there was someone in there watching us. I looked around, but there was no one, so I thought nothing more of it. We finished the movie, and I drove her home. When we arrived, I got out, and we stood in front of the headlights, hugged and said our goodbyes. Then out of nowhere, the shadow of a pair of legs walked through the headlights. We both saw it, and thought, what the hell? We looked everywhere for what it could have been, but no one was home. Her parents were on a business trip. I noticed then that my girlfriend was frozen and hyperventilating, and her eyes were fixated on the corner of their big shed. I quickly got her out of there as she told me she'd seen this thing that regularly torments her in her dreams. It was just standing there. She said it was at least 11 feet tall, standing over half the height of the shed, was very spindly, and was wearing a top hat, interestingly enough. She said it was staring at us both. Now normally I would have been like, okay, but the sheer fact that we both saw those long legs pass through the headlights was enough for me. One of the worst experiences happened that same year around Christmas 2013. I was in Afghanistan working as a contractor, and we were getting bombed quite a bit. Usually around holidays, those types of things amp up, which is nothing new. So I decided to go to sleep, being what's called a bee hut. Basically, it's a wooden building sectioned off into various rooms by thin plywood walls. But hey, at least we had our own space. So I settled down for the night, and turning onto my side and shutting my eyes, in that split second I was paralyzed and couldn't move. I felt a horrifying presence appear behind me. And all right, this has happened before, so whatever, it'll go away, right? Well, whatever this was, wrapped its arms around me, one underneath me and the other over the top, like a bear hug, and it then began to squeeze as that rushing, chaotic sound came back. It was pretty damn scary. I was having trouble breathing when all of a sudden it all just stopped, but the arms remained around me. I didn't know what to expect, and was still mentally fighting it, when a voice suddenly spoke out. It was the most guttural, gut-wrenching voice I had ever heard, and the words it spoke I can still hear today. It said, "I'm going to burn and rape you." Then the arms started squeezing again, and I was freaking out completely. The sound was once again roaring in my ears, and then everything vanished. I jumped out of my bed and went outside into the snow to chain smoke for about an hour. I eventually calmed down and went back to bed, but this time I slept on my back, shut my eyes, and once again couldn't move. That same presence materialized again, and my bed started shaking, as if an earthquake were rocking it. The shaking stopped eventually, and I felt my bed pull down to the right, like something had grabbed onto the frame. Then this thing pulled itself up from my bed, pinned my arms and legs down, and started pushing me down. The strangest part of it, though, was I felt a hot breath on my face, and it smelled. I don't recall what of, though. It vanished again, and I went back outside to smoke some more to calm my nerves. Then I went back inside, and it happened a third time, but didn't touch me. I could tell it was standing in the corner of my room, watching me until I fell asleep. I've asked some people about this, and some have said they think it was a demon, and some have said it was a jinn. But whatever it was wasn't pleasant, so any comments on this would be greatly appreciated. A year or so later, whilst in Germany, I once ran into that same figure from Afghanistan, and I'm positive I saw it. I put down my video games to go to the hallway to get to the bathroom, and as I opened up the door and looked down the hallway, I felt that same presence appear. I knew that feeling. Then a silhouette started to form. It was the shape of something big, muscular, and was extremely tall, maybe 8 feet or more. It was slouched because the ceiling was too low for it to be fully erect, and it was slowly moving left to right, like it needed to breathe. By this point I could make out its shape perfectly after rubbing my eyes a few times, as it was dark, and I simply stared at it and said, "Nope," and I shut the door. I sat around until the presence had disappeared, and years later, I was describing this experience to my little sister. She claimed to be able to see energies almost, i.e. black and white orbs of light. I don't know. It's a hard one to describe, as she said she'd seen multiple white and black orbs around me, all the time. I was about to start talking about my experiences when she started completely freaking out. She was looking down the hallway, and I asked what she could see, and she perfectly described what I had seen in Germany, before I could even tell her. She said it was staring at me right then and there, but I felt no fear. I just walked to where she was staring. I definitely felt its presence, though rather subdued. I just found it strange that she'd seen it too. Over the years, I've had some run-ins in my dreams, or my current cat will freak out, getting my attention. But normally, I'll recognize the presence of whatever it is before my cat does, and I'll pay these things no mind whenever I can. I'll have some very extreme night terrors dealing with these things sometimes, but I always come out okay. Overall, I've had incidences where I'm awake, asleep, and everything in between, and I'm curious as to why this happens, what you all might think these situations are, and what those entities may have been. I'm extremely interested in learning more about it, and eventually confronting it. To this day, I still have a deep mistrust of people in full-body costumes, mascots in particular, because of this encounter. This happened when I was around 10 or 11 years old, putting it somewhere between 2007 and 2008. I have a pretty terrible memory when it comes to my childhood, but I'm pretty sure it happened before I was in middle school. The street I grew up on was one of those with a bunch of kids who always hung out after school. My family knew almost everyone on our street, save for a couple of houses, and even if a family didn't have kids our age, most people would at least come out for holidays like the 4th of July. So as we grew up, we always had a general idea of who our neighbours were. My younger brother D, who's 3 years younger than me, and I were especially close with a family about 5 houses down and across the street. Their son T was a year younger than me, and his little sister, A, was only a year or 2 younger than my brother, so we hung out a lot. This particular day, D and I asked our parents if we could go play with T and A at their house, and considering it was still early in the evening, they agreed. Now, due to the close distance, the walk to their house only ever took a minute or so, and as D and I started on our way, I couldn't help but notice a figure in the distance, dressed all in black from head to toe. I thought it was weird, of course, but I couldn't tell which way they were facing, and T's house was so close that I didn't give them too much thought. As we got closer, however, I realized the figure was walking towards us. As we got closer to each other, I also realized they weren't dressed in all black as I'd originally thought, but were wearing a gorilla suit. It was really strange, and even to this day I have no logical explanation for it. But I was definitely creeped out, and I wish I could say that's where my creepy encounter ended. But unfortunately, that's not the case. D and I were only a house away from our friend's place at this point, but the closer we got to their house, the closer we got to the gorilla person. Right as we started to turn to get onto the sidewalk, the person started almost galloping towards us, making loud gorilla noises. Mind you, this person hadn't said a word this entire time, and now they were charging towards us, making these strange sounds, so we, of course, panicked. My brother and I started sprinting towards T's house, my heart pounding hard in my chest as I thought about what might happen if the gorilla person got to us first. We started pounding on the door, and T's mom answered, looking concerned and confused. Through the tears that I was fighting so hard to hold back, I somehow managed to say something about the creep who had started rushing at us, and she quickly ushered us inside. We told her what had happened and she checked outside, but the person was long gone at that point. After that, we never saw that person or costume again. What gets me the most about this, and what still sends shivers up my spine, is that we never found out who that person was. They likely were just some adult who thought it'd be hilarious to scare the crap out of a couple of kids. But the fact that we'll never know for sure still creeps me out. Considering we knew almost everyone on our street, I thought maybe at some point someone would joke about that time they'd scared me and my brother, and we'd all have a good laugh about it. But that day never came. I don't think we'll ever know who it was or why they were wearing a gorilla suit in the first place. Stay safe out there, everyone. And if you're the person who chased 2 kids in a gorilla costume 14 to 15 years ago, thanks for the lifelong trauma. My mum's dog, Punky, R.I.P., was very sweet and loving. She was an ESA dog, but trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I had never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she was alive, and never growled or nipped at anyone. She had no sense of smell, so she loved all animals and people, and was a real gentle giant among our little terriers at 60 pounds. What I'm getting at here is that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only saw it once. I, an 11-year-old female, was at home with my siblings, 2 brothers and 6 females, and my then stepdad was at work. My mum ran up to the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. It was only a mile or 2 away from us. And for reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods, on a dead-end road at the time, and you had to really make an effort to find our place, navigate down our rickety driveway, and find the front door. I was sitting at the computer having a grand time watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden, all of our dogs, 2 Boston Terriers and 1 Chihuahua, perked up, barked a few times, and began investigating down the hall. My siblings were napping in the bedroom at the end of the hall, so I figured they must have just stirred and scared the dogs. But Punky sat up suddenly. She stood up on the couch and puffed her chest out with her ears perked up, her fur standing on end and her tail straightening up. Then she started barking, loudly. I mean, the bark boomed through the living room and echoed all around. Then she lunged off the couch and went tearing down the hallway. Now, I was already on edge because I don't think I'd heard her bark ever. She's a Benzinji mix, so her bark is more of a baying sound. But this was a big, loud, alert bark. So I stood up and went to look down the hallway, ready to fight off what I was assuming was a shadow monster, based on how the dogs were behaving. But then I heard it. Someone was knocking. Now, we didn't get visitors because of how weird our house was, location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do. The only people who showed up here were family, and they didn't knock, so I slowly walked towards the front door. The knock drew the attention of the dogs again, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky. I felt better with our 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were all the size of New York City sewer rats. So I opened the door just a little, where there was the sketchiest looking man I think I've ever seen, standing on our porch. I can still picture him perfectly even now. He was a really thin, taller man with dark hair and a sunken face. He had bags under his eyes and half-managed hair, sort of like he'd just given it a quick brush and thought that was good enough. Everything about him just seemed a little too thin, a little too shallow, and his clothes were all off too. They were nice, but fake nice, you know? Like a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and new jeans, but he had what looked like a suit jacket on. All his clothes were dark too, despite the fact that it was summer in Texas and the weather was into the hundreds that day. He also had this plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand, and it looked like the label had been covered up and taped over. "Hey there, kiddo. I'm trying to sell this here carpet cleaner," he said, shaking the bottle at me. "Mind if I come in to show you how good it works?" Now, alarms were going off in my head, because he just seemed so off. And looking back from an adult perspective, the fact that he hadn't asked if my parents were home is really unnerving, because he probably knew they weren't, and that's why he was here in the first place. I should have told him to get off our property, that I'd have to get my mum, anything than what I did say. But I didn't. Instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, we don't have carpet." "Well, it works on other things," he said, and he took a big step towards the door and shook the bottle at me again. I started to properly freak out at that point and thought it was time to close the door. But the thing is, our front door didn't even lock. Small town, hard to access home, so we never needed one. So it was basically useless. I was sure there was something very wrong about to happen though, and I was absolutely terrified. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do in the few seconds I had before anything happened, when all of a sudden I heard it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared, and was snarling like a feral animal. She had slobber dripping from her mouth, her ears were down, and she was ready to attack. The guy heard it too, and as I looked towards Punky, she tried to lunge past me, and I just barely caught her with my leg as she tried her hardest to attack this guy. He freaked out and ran off the porch without another word, and booked it down the driveway as I let Punky out, along with the rest of our dogs that began to chase him. Our small dogs went after him down the driveway and stopped about halfway, barking and jumping out. But Punky stayed on the porch and watched him with her ears perked, just staring into the distance until he disappeared. And I swear I saw someone join up with him running when he got onto the road. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. No barking or growling, just laying around, mouth and throat covered in slobber still. I realized my siblings were still down the hall, so I ran in to check on them, and when I got to the bedroom, my siblings were all still sleeping soundly, but the bedroom window was wide open, the curtains pushed all to one side, and the items on the dresser in front of the window had been moved around. Someone had tried to climb through the window. No doubt in my mind about it. From what I can gather, the bedroom window was visible from the couch where Punky was sleeping, so I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky had gone after them and scared them off, and the man at the door was meant to distract me. They definitely didn't expect Punky, a bigger dog, because most of the time she was with my mum inside whilst our small dogs were the ones that saw the public eye more often. And I don't know what they'd intended to do, but after my mum got home she took all of us to my aunt's house, and on our way there we saw the men walking up someone else's driveway. Men, plural, because we watched a second one split off to wait by the road. So to the two men apparently going door to door to sell their unlabeled carpet cleaner, I'd really rather not see you again. So I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor, and a couple of days ago, a student of mine and good friend, who I had taken out into the woods before, told me his dad had just acquired 150 acres of land in a secluded, mountainous part of my state. It had a large amount of forest on it that hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that only took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses at the moment were free to roam the grounds. He said his dad had gotten an insane deal on the property, and my friend is now a dad of 3, and I know he doesn't get out into the woods much, so I agreed to go with him because it seemed a really fun idea, and I could imagine he needed a getaway. And we are both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival and all sorts of other things, so we never run out of anything to talk about. His dad, however, told us that he didn't want anybody exploring the area unless we had a gun, as he said it was because he'd seen coyotes about. Now we're all indigenous here, we're raised in the same state, and coyotes don't actually attack people. My friend, who we'll call RC, also told me a while back that when he was first at the property, he'd seen movement in the tree lines that was roughly human-sized, but he couldn't really tell since his eyesight isn't that good. I'd brought my AR and a small flint napping kit just for the fun of it. Then we set off onto the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, multiple natural springs and ponds, and everything felt normal, and it was beautiful landscape. Eventually we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. But as soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own that was very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. It was grey and dead silent, save for the occasional creaking of tall, tired cedar trees, and there was a small stream running through the centre of it with sand that was black. It felt like we were surrounded and were being watched from all sides. Then it didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odour of rotting flesh, so we decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and couldn't find any bullet holes, and it didn't appear to me that these cows had been put down. Something had killed them though, and their bones were spread over a 30-yard area. There were large indentations in the dirt all around them that were very vague in their shape. So after this strange discovery, we decided to press on into the woods. Now we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odour of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream as I'd noticed several different types of tracks, large coyote tracks, and something else that was large but had intentionally avoided the sand. We pressed on until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees whilst they were still alive, which is something that could never, ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what I can only describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because although it looked primitive, it looked way more primitive than a person would make, but it was an intentionally designed and built tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had more large oval tracks surrounding it, and on the other side of the pond we found a very strange little tree structure. It was an A-frame, had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very peculiarly placed. We found no signs of any campfires around it, and we found no camping trash, but this isn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. It was getting dark, so we decided we should head back. I had a flashlight on my AR, but I didn't want to rely on that, so we were in the dark with something that kills cows and makes tools out of their bones. We made our way out the forest and back to where the trucks were parked, just in time before it got too dark to see. But as we were leaving, we saw something on top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify, but didn't stick around to find out. It's worth mentioning the previous owner began construction of something on the property, but abruptly halted construction and left. I, a female and 20 years old at the time, used to live in a fairly sketchy part of a big UK city. I would get the bus into uni every day, but one time I was driving back to my parents straight after my lectures, so decided to pick up my friend who was on the same course as me, a female who was 21 at the time, and we drove into uni for the first time together. For context, I drove a 2006 Ford car, which was pretty battered by this point, with a couple of dents and lots of scratches, but it did the job. Now there is a clean air zone on the main route into my uni that the bus takes, meaning only buses, taxis or permit holders could drive that way. So my Google Maps took me a route I had never been on before, which went through this pretty quiet and non-residential place, so there wasn't anyone around, and all this took place about 2 p.m. in broad daylight. I noticed a fairly nice sports car following close behind us that had 2 men, about mid-30s, inside it. They had flashed their lights at me a few times, but I had just ignored it, thinking they had seen us in the car and were trying to flirt or something. But when we came to slow down to stop at some traffic lights, they mounted the curb and quickly drove in front of us, then parked their car on an angle across the road so I couldn't get past. The driver of the car got out, approached my car, signalling for me to get out, which weirdly enough didn't scare me at all. I was a fairly new driver and was confused, just thinking I had done something wrong. but it was raining, so I wound down my window slightly instead of getting out. He asked where we were going, and when I said to uni, he told me I had 2 flat tires and wouldn't make it there safely. I asked if he was sure, because my car felt fine to me, so he told me to get out and come take a look. I proceeded to very, very stupidly take my belt off to get out. Please don't ask me why. I'm from a small and safe town, so was not very streetwise. But thankfully, my friend had more sense than me and grabbed me to stop me, and she also pressed a button above my radio which locked all my car doors. Thank God for her. The man saw this, which made him angry, and he started trying to open my door. He began shouting at the other guy, still in the passenger seat of the car in front, in a different language. Then the other guy started to get out of the car. At this point I screamed and reversed my car so I could drive around them, and luckily there was no traffic coming, so I was able to run the red light without issue to get away from them. I was fully expecting the man to follow us, but they just got back in their car, turned around and drove back the way they'd come from. Needless to say, I didn't have flat tires, and it sounds so stupid to say now, but I honestly didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed they were trying to scam me into buying some new tires or something. However, now I'm a couple of years older. I keep thinking back on how creepy this whole incident was, and wonder what would have happened if I had gotten out of the car, or what would have happened to my friend if they had taken the car with her in it. I do think that they were more than likely trying to steal my car, and would have told my friend to get out, but this still doesn't make complete sense, considering my car would have been worth about £300, or even less with how old and battered it was. This story takes place at my neighbour's house when I was a younger teenager. In 2010, my family and I moved into our house that our cousin used to own, and it was located at the end of a dirt road. All of our neighbours are family members, so right up the road is my other cousin who was my age, and we were good friends. We used to hang out all the time, and I have many horror stories that include her, and also things I've experienced on my own. The neighbour's house I'll be referring to in this story is our closest neighbour, and they are also cousins. So whenever I walked to my cousin's house, who I'll refer to as Elle, I'd have to pass by my other neighbours to get there. So one night I was walking home from Elle's house, and as I got to my neighbour's house, I stopped dead in my tracks. They have a set of glass doors right out front, but they always had the blinds down. They were never raised. However, this time they were open, and the lights were on. But this was late at night, and there were no other lights on. The people who live there are my grandma's cousin and her youngest son, who is about 15 years older than me. But what I saw scared me so intensely I couldn't move. I saw a young girl with long black hair in a white gown, her back to me as she played the piano. I had never seen her before, and no new cars were in their yard. After standing outside watching this girl play the piano, the song playing loudly enough that I could hear it outside, my heart was racing, and then I quickly ran the rest of the way home, which wasn't very far. The second I got home, I texted Elle and told her what I'd seen, and within minutes we agreed to meet right outside my neighbour's house so she could see the scary sight too. It took just a few minutes for both of us to make it to my neighbour's, and by the time we had, there was no song, no lights, and the blinds were once again pulled all the way down. My cousin and I were even more freaked out now, and after some talking, we just went home. The next day we asked our family if they'd seen the girl arrive, or knew who she was, and they said there was one girl who fit that description, but she was dead. She died whilst locked up in a mental institution before we were even born. Now, I wasn't as close to my neighbours as I am now, so years went by with that mystery, and only recently as an adult did I ask them about that night, and they'd never had a girl there like that ever. And not only that, the piano hasn't worked in years. They felt just as freaked out as I was when I told them, because they definitely never had a girl over. To this day I've not seen her again, but the memory of that time will never go away. What seemed like an innocent sight of a young girl playing the piano was really something unseemly. After playing her song, she'd vanished and wasn't seen again, at least not by me. So I've been suffering from sleep paralysis for a number of years, and it's been fairly tame up until recently. Shortly after my dad's death, who died in early September, the sleep paralysis has changed and become far more vivid and terrifying. I am aware that stress, anxiety, and grief can all be factors in triggering or enhancing the problem, and I always know when it's coming. I sleep on my side, and when it starts, a low pressure starts from my shoulder down to my chest. Usually it'll be the odd moving shadow, a loud bang, or a whispering kind of voice after that, which was scary but not terrifying. I kind of got used to it after a while. But recently it's become really bad. The first time it changed, I was lying on my side looking out across my room. The normal pressure on my side started, then I glanced over to the center of the room where there was something crouching. As I tried to make out any distinctive features, it bolted and dove under my bed. It moved on all fours and looked humanoid, and that's all I could make out from it. One time a withered hand appeared and violently tried to grasp at my face, and another time I saw nothing, but heard a low female, whispery voice behind me saying, "You're not gonna make it." Then it giggled. The most recent encounter was a month ago when I got home from a busy day at work. I lay down, and as I did I got that same pressure. I wasn't exactly in the mood for it though. I just wanted to rest and not see anything terrifying, so I kind of struggled against it, trying to force myself awake, which was a big mistake, because it just made it all a lot worse. I looked up into the center of my room and there it was. It was tall, thin, with shoulder-length hair, and was gaunt with blood-red skin. Its eyes had this weird, luminous look to them, like a light as it slowly was going out. I could tell it was female by the build of its body, but I could be wrong. Whatever it was though, it was angry, and it started walking towards me, shaking its head, and it was rapidly becoming impossible to tell if it still had 2 eyes or 4. It was screaming in anger at me. It sounded like a cat being tortured. But the dream thankfully ended when it reached me. The most recent incident was this week, after I'd had a long busy one, and a couple of days ago I crashed out. Multiple hands were reaching for my face this time, and that same female voice appeared at the same time, almost in a dismissive, mocking way. "I've had many people carve my name in their chest," she said, which I have zero idea what that means, as trust me, I've looked. But it turns out that if this isn't my mind trying to mess with me, then the red lady creature likes being cryptic about who she is. If anyone has come across this in folklore, or just in general, I would really like to know. I'm pretty sure it's all stress related, but I'd be interested to know if there's anything else to it. Since I was 13, I have lived with a condition called narcolepsy. An extra little gift from the condition is onset sleep paralysis, or more specifically, hypnagogic hallucinations, meaning it's normal while falling asleep to get, shall we say, stuck. On occasion I will have this sensation whilst falling asleep that I'm submerged deeper and deeper underwater, and eventually once I'm deep enough I'll fall asleep. It's the way down that's weird. The deeper I go, the longer it takes to snap out of it, and I can feel my body but I can't move it, and this is where it gets really weird. I'll be falling asleep and begin to feel something moving my blankets, touching my face, or more dramatically, I'll be outright assaulted, grabbed, choked, or violated. I'm not asleep, but I'm not awake either. Night terrors are another product of narcolepsy. I don't experience them very often, but when I do, they can be traumatic. I still remember some I've had regardless of how long it's been. Dreams of being held captive with family members and them watching as I was being flayed alive, then escaping and hiding whilst the buildings around me are being bombed with screams of the wounded. A woman's legs being crushed beneath fallen debris, and in shock she begs me to take her daughters to safety as she still holds the hand of a child beneath the wreckage. Both of these experiences have a strange residual effect. Then I'll snap out of it or wake up, and still feel whatever the hell was going on, my skin tingling or outright sore with no visible injury from whatever was happening. Eventually I got used to it, as there's a recognizable feeling or intuition to what's happening, and I can shrug off whatever messed up thing I'd just experienced. Now to the story. When I was 17, I went to visit my uncle's newborn, my cousin, and right away I could tell that there was something that was bothering him. Shortly he opened up about what was happening and said, "Adam, there's something weird going on in this house. Light bulbs are being thrown down the stairs and are missing from their sockets. I'm hearing running up and down the stairs along with heavy footsteps around the house, and doors slamming." Coming from a Metis family having had many spooky situations, we have been raised to pay attention to how a house makes you feel, against reason, and to be skeptical and distant despite reason when you do. That being said, the next thing my uncle asked was for me to go check it out. He's made himself a cool little man cave in the basement, so when I sat on the couch and looked around, all was good, nothing weird about it. That is until I became transfixed on this purple painting on the wall. It was perpendicular to a Muhammad Ali picture, and the reflection of Ali off the painting looked weird. I stared at it a while and got a huge chill up my spine, and trying to make my eyes focus, I thought I was looking at the face of a balding, heavy-set white man. Now a bit bugged out, I went back upstairs and said that, yeah, it's definitely creepy. Having school the next morning, I had planned to stay over, and when I headed to bed, which was in the spare room, it took me a little bit to settle and relax, and it wasn't long until I was slipping away. But this time was different. I was totally aware of my body, as I was in this fully lucid dream. I could see that I was standing outside of the house and was staring at the brick wall of my room. Then slowly and strangely moving closer and closer to the house, I had this sensation that I felt like I wasn't at the wheel here. Unblinkingly and slowly moving towards the house, I couldn't snap out of it, not until I was so close to the wall that I was nearly walking into it. Coming to with a harrowing chill up my spine, I shook it off, relaxed, and tried again to go to sleep. So I rolled over with the blanket over my shoulders and tried to think of soothing thoughts. But I ended up getting frustrated, not being able to focus. So I rolled over onto my back after several minutes, and that's when I felt this huge weight on my chest. But this was different. This time I wasn't asleep. I was kicking my legs and trying to move my arms that were pinned to either side of my head, and I was sunken deeply into the mattress, feeling this excess weight push me deeper. I couldn't breathe and was coughing and gasping, and this lasted for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 seconds. I was able to lift my head slightly and watched the blanket being pulled off of me. I froze completely, and honestly at this point I could think and see myself move, struggling like I was awake, but my own screams couldn't come out. They were like this loud echo inside my head. Once it had all stopped, I rolled onto the floor and went to the wall where I had to catch my breath before I could call for help. When my uncle came in, and what sticks with me is that there was this very neat pile of bed sheets at the foot of the bed, and the only way I could have accomplished this is by standing on the bed, holding the blanket spread out and slowly dropped it into a neat pile on the floor. I still rack my brains about that night, and thankfully I haven't had an episode like it before or since. My uncle has had a daughter and has spent many years in that house, but the weird stuff never stopped. My uncle has caught his son at 3 a.m. talking to himself and staring at the ceiling, and when asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "Mr. Nobody." He was asked what Mr. Nobody looks like, and he replied, "He has a big black face with red eyes." I was asked to babysit them when they were 4 and 2. At 3 p.m., as soon as my uncle had left, I had one cousin bawling at the door and the other trying to convince me that there was footprints trying to lead me into the basement. Hell no, I thought, and I closed that door. Everything went smoothly until around 1 a.m. after they'd both fallen asleep. My adrenaline kicked in hard when I could hear wheezing or difficult breathing, and I immediately checked on them both, and they were thankfully fine. I then sat down on the couch, but started hearing it again. Nope, this is my first time babysitting. I can't afford to get spooked or messed with. So I turned up the TV and ended up falling asleep a little while later. I woke up about 3:30 a.m., and the oldest of my cousins was standing in front of the TV. I called to him, but he wouldn't respond. So I kept calling until I seemed to have gotten through to him, and I touched him on the shoulder. The poor guy's face melted and he began bawling his eyes out. Confused and scared, needless to say, he slept on the couch with me. They all moved out about a year after this, and to this day both kids can recall who Mr. Nobody is, and neither have slept-walked since. Despite trying to discredit myself, knowing that I have a predisposition for nocturnal hallucinations, I reluctantly believe that what I experienced wasn't that, and that many other strange experiences after are of a supernatural nature, and nothing can be done about it. What are your thoughts? Now, I get followed by random people on Instagram all the time, and creepy messages don't really bother me anymore. There are a lot of weirdos out there, and I tend to read the messages out of curiosity, as sometimes they can be really funny. Last year, one account stood out to me because it had DM'd me saying, "You should ride in our clown car." I looked at the profile, and many of the images featured very creepy clown illustrations and photos. I actually drew a few of them in my notepad, because I'm intrigued by strange things like that. But the username seemed like gibberish to me. I googled it, and it turned out to be a German author's name written as one word. I showed my boyfriend the account, and we both thought it was pretty weird, but funny regardless. So I replied to him asking if I was an e-girl, and they struck up conversation with me, which became increasingly more explicit from his side as it went on. Now again, I'm used to this kind of thing, so my boyfriend and I thought we'd just troll for a bit. He was much creepier than some others though, as he spoke with an intelligence and authority that showed me he was older and much smarter than the usual creeps who messaged me. He wanted to know more and more about my private life with my boyfriend, so I thought I'd bargain with him. He had mentioned he was a journalist, so I asked if I could read some of his material in exchange for my fake answers, because I kind of wanted to know who this guy was. An example of a message he sent is, "Good girl, Sarah. There's really no reason to wait to open your legs if you feel that primal attraction and chemistry. Do you tell him to wear a condom, or do you rather enjoy the feeling of being filled?" Now usually I would have blocked such a weirdo by now, but I got worried when he said something about teaching me AP style. I became concerned that he was a teacher. If he was willing to message me, a 20-year-old, maybe he was willing to message girls a lot younger than that, or girls he had power over as their teacher. It was just a hunch at the time, but I decided to keep on trying to investigate. And eventually he sent me a message saying, "You're going to put me in professor mode, and I won't be able to get any salacious slight enjoyment out of you sexually, because I'll see you as a student." Bingo. I was right. I felt sick at this, but I now became determined to work out who he was and wanted to expose him to whoever he worked for. I asked him if he'd ever looked at his students how he was looking at me, and he said, "What professor hasn't? Rarely but occasionally you have an enthusiastic and attractive young student, and you will always consider, what if, from time to time." I got the impression it wasn't such a rare experience for him though, so I started Googling his username again, and found a list of university teachers from across the US and UK who had interest in this German author. I spent hours collecting information, but he obviously wasn't willing to tell me who he was. He actually seemed entertained by the idea of me guessing. I began to get frustrated, so I decided to try and get his IP address. I was worried he'd realize this and block me, or do the same to me and threaten me, but I was too invested in trying to find out who he was now. I disguised it in a fake link and got his location, but he didn't catch on, and this narrowed down my search a lot. He was actually messaging me whilst he was on his university campus, but I still wasn't sure which teacher was him, so I emailed the university, pretending to be a student, asking if any professors had expertise on the author I had found in his username. I made up an essay title I was working on, and they replied the next day with a name. I'd been suggesting to him I was trying to work out who he was, so I sent him a message saying, "Hello John, I've found you." He knew his time was up and I'd got him. Then I emailed the university from a burner account for fear of getting sued for defamation, with screenshots of his messages outlining my concerns for his students and how I'd discovered his identity. I never heard anything back from them, and I don't know what happened to the clown man, but I really hope he was at least fired. So the one thing I learned that weekend was to never stay up past 3 a.m. while staying in a Canadian cottage that's next to a forest and a haunted lake. When I was 13, I had this friend named Veronica. We were both obsessed with scary stories and legends, and one weekend, she'd invited me to stay at her cottage. We had lots of fun during the day, going swimming, hiking, kayaking, and playing video games, and once it got dark, we decided to try and stay up all night. But first we wanted to see if the Canadian legend of the Wendigo was true. We waited for it to get darker. Then we told her 16-year-old sister that we were going to go to the forest to see if the Wendigo legend was true. Her sister believed in this kind of stuff, but was too scared to see if it was real. So she called us insane and said it was a horrible idea. But nevertheless, I grabbed the flashlight, my friend's hand, and we ran to the woods. Now the legend says that to summon the Wendigo, once in a Canadian forest at night, you must whistle. And luckily for me, I didn't know how to whistle, so Veronica had to be the one to do it. She did so, and then we stood there as quietly as possible. 5 seconds went by, then 10, and we were about to calmly turn back and walk out the forest. Then we heard a twig snap. The snap was followed by a noise that sounded like a moose mixed with a groan from a human. We ran back to the cottage as fast as we could. We didn't tell her sister about any of it. We just went straight to our room. We got bored after a while, so she told me about a legend that had been around the neighborhood. The legend claimed that if you go to the lake at 3 a.m. and tap your foot in the water 3 times, something will try to pull you down into the water, and if there's no one there to help you, you're doomed. For some reason, we decided that we would try it, so we snuck into the kitchen once everyone was asleep to get some ice cream and coffee in order to not fall asleep, and eventually 3 a.m. arrived. We did what the legend said, but I only felt something touch my foot. After that, we thought the rest of the night was going to be normal. But boy, were we wrong. We changed our minds about not sleeping and finally got ready for bed. But we were too scared to turn the lights off, so we just turned them down. But maybe it would have been less scary with them off completely. About an hour later, I still couldn't sleep, So I turned to Vera and opened my eyes, and hers were already wide open. I asked her what was wrong, but all she said was, "Don't look in the corner." But of course I did, and I saw a tall black figure standing there. I looked back at Vera and she asked, "Is it gone?" We both looked back into the corner and it was in fact gone. "Looks like it," I said. We didn't get any sleep that night, and the worst thing, we had to stay there another night. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.